Tonight, we slip into the black waters of the Venetian Lagoon, where gondolas glide by lantern light, and just beyond the laughter waits an island no map dare celebrate. Poveglia, once a plague pit, where ash and bone choke the soil. Once an asylum, where screams climbed the bell tower and never came back down. Fishermen still find skulls in their nets. Travelers still whisper of voices in the fog. It has no sanctuary, no forgiveness, only a question that refuses to drown. How many dead before the island itself becomes a disease? They say the ground remembers, not in the way memory works in our heads, fractured and distorted by bias, but in a grotesque, honest way. Every scream, every final breath, every body dumped like trash leaves an echo. Poveglia Island, a tiny speck in the Venetian Lagoon, cut off by water and centuries of superstition, doesn't just echo, it howls. And if you're unlucky enough to stand on its soil, you'll hear it. Some people claim the ground crunches differently, because beneath the thin crust of grass and weeds, the dirt isn't really dirt. It's ash, human ash. Over 100,000 people burned, buried, and forgotten until the land itself became a grave. Tourists whisper about it as if it's some horror movie set piece. A plague island, a cursed spot where birds won't fly. But the locals, they don't laugh. Fishermen will steer their boats wide, willing to lose half a day rather than let their nets scrape the shoreline. Because sometimes the nets come back heavy with something they didn't ask for. Bones, femurs, skulls, finger joints, curled like the remnants of a forgotten hand raised in protest. One Venetian doctor, curious, skeptical, maybe arrogant, once scoffed at these tales and set foot on Poveglia. He had been told of the island's reputation, of restless souls clawing at sanity, but he dismissed them as peasant myths. He wanted to study madness scientifically. Within weeks, he was jumping from the bell tower, his body crumpling against stone and sea. Witnesses swore he screamed about shadows dragging him down, invisible hands strangling his thoughts. Maybe it was illness, maybe it was guilt, or maybe the ground really does remember. And what it remembers is Sinister, Venice, the floating jewel of Italy. Gondolas drifting through canals like veins feeding a decadent heart. The city always smelled faintly of salt and rot, a perfume of beauty on the verge of collapse. By the late Middle Ages, it wasn't just palazzos and mass carnivals. It was also death, the Black Death, to be precise. Bubonic plague stalled through Europe like a starving wolf, and Venice, with its wealth and trade routes, became one of its favorite hunting grounds. Ships carried spices, silks, and rats. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried death. In this chaos, governments turned pragmatic, cruelly pragmatic. Bodies piled faster than priests could bless them, faster than gravediggers could shovel earth. Cities needed quarantine stations, places to dump the infected, somewhere far enough that the wealthy could breathe without fear of catching death on the breeze. The Venetian Lagoon had many small islands, abandoned monasteries, and patches of land perfect for this terrible efficiency. And Poveglia, quiet, isolated, reachable only by boat, became one of them. Imagine being ferried there. You're coughing, sweating, half mad from fever. Maybe you're clutching your child. Maybe you're tied down because you're resisting. Across the water, you see the spires of Venice, the home you'll never walk again. The boatmen don't speak. They just push you onto the shore, and the boat leaves. Behind you, screams ash, a mass grave waiting to swallow. Ahead of you, silence, broken only by the bells tolling from across the lagoon, marking the deaths piling by the hour. And when plague wasn't enough, wars came. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as Venice staggered through political decline, Poveglia was fortified. Cannons lined its edges, soldiers patrolled in the island, already soaked to the dead, braced for the living to kill each other upon it. Disease, war, fire, the land kept swallowing. By the 20th century, the story should have ended there, left to moss and gulls. But it didn't. Italy decided Poveglia would serve another purpose, not as a battlefield or a plague pit, but as an asylum. And that's when the legends curdle from tragedy into horror. Because when you place the vulnerable, the forgotten, the mentally ill on soil built from bones, you're not just housing them, you're feeding the land fresh blood. If Poveglia has a face, it isn't a plague victim or a nameless soldier. It's the doctor. His name is lost to history, scrubbed from records the way you erase something too shameful to admit. But his legend is stitched into the island's soil. He arrived in the early 20th century, when Poveglia had been converted into a psychiatric hospital, a place for the inconveniently broken-mind society didn't want parading through Venice's piazzas. By then, asylums across Europe weren't hospitals so much as dumping grounds. Families sent away their embarrassments, the depressed, the hysterical, the alcoholic, the epileptic. The unlucky ones ended up in facilities run by men like him. The doctor allegedly fancied himself a pioneer of the mind. What that really meant was drills, hammers, crude instruments designed for lobotomies and experimental surgeries. He called it science. Patients called it torture. Witness accounts, filtered through decades of retelling, whispers, and folklore, claim that screams echoed daily from the hospital. The bell tower, visible across the lagoon, became a kind of twisted metronome for suffering. He supposedly dragged patients into its upper rooms, where the wind howled through cracks in stone, and experimented. Lobotomies without anesthesia, trepanations, drilling holes into skulls to let the madness escape. If blood seeped into the stone, if bones shattered, well, no one on the mainland cared. The insane had no voices, no advocates. And here's where the story slithers from history into nightmare. Some say the doctor began seeing shadows, that his patients whispered back to him in voices not their own, that the island, fattened on centuries of plague dead, had started feeding on him too. One night, he allegedly stumbled up to the bell tower, chased by something invisible. Witnesses on nearby islands claimed they heard his final screams, not of pain but of terror, before his body fell. When locals retrieved him, he was still alive, broken but breathing, until they say a thick mist crawled up and suffocated him, finishing what gravity couldn't. Legend? Folklore? Maybe. But ask Venetians today about Poveglia, and their voices lower. They'll tell you the asylum's ruins still stand, its windows gaping like sockets, its walls streaked with mold and ash. They'll tell you the doctor's shadow lingers in the tower, peering down as if still waiting for the next patient. And they'll tell you this: on Poveglia, the line between victim and villain blurs. Sometimes the ground eats the innocent. Sometimes it eats the guilty too. The strange thing about evil is how quietly it begins. Not with screams, not with flames, but with something ordinary. A cough, a rumor, a door that shuts and doesn't open again. For Poveglia, the disturbance was a single event but a creeping pattern. And then, suddenly, a crack in the pattern that no one could ignore. Picture this: Venice in the grip of plague. The 14th century. Corpses litter the canals. Priests too tired to bless them. At first, the dead are buried hastily in the city itself. But disease spreads. Panic climbs. Someone, a magistrate, a desperate noble who knows, gives the order. Send them to the islands. The disturbance begins. Poveglia becomes a funnel. Not just the sick, but anyone suspected of being sick. Families dragged apart. Children sobbing as gondoliers row them away from shore. The island's soil darkens with ash. Bonfires fueled not just by wood, but by bodies stacked like cordwood. Eyewitness accounts, fragmented, centuries old, describe smoke so thick it cloaked the lagoon, a perpetual dusk. This was no longer an island. It was an oven for the unwanted. And then came the story that still curdles blood. During one wave of plague, officials supposedly ran out of time to separate the living from the dead. The sick were hurled into pits already aflame, their limbs twitching in the fire, their screams blending with those of the dying. Some clawed their way back out, only to be thrown in again. That's the first real disturbance. That moment when necessity crosses into atrocity, and human beings stop pretending they're human. Venice survived, yes. The city's marble glistened. Its trade thrived again. But beneath that prosperity was a little island turned septic with grief. And centuries later, when the asylum opened its doors, survivors whispered that you could still hear it. At night, under the whine of cicadas, the ground pulsed with noises that weren't natural. Muffled moans, frantic scratching, cries that had no throats. The past was not past. The first disturbance never ended. It only shifted shape. Here's where it gets slippery, where fact and folklore hook arms and start dancing in circles until you can't tell one from the other. Poveglia has plenty of written history. Records of plague quarantines, military fortifications, even asylum administration papers buried in Venetian archives. But what seeps through the cracks of the stories, and they're too consistent, too stubborn, to dismiss as campfire exaggeration. Visitors who dared step foot their described air that tastes wrong, heavy metallic, as if you've bitten your tongue, but the blood's outside your mouth. One group of bricklayers sent to repair part of the asylum's walls fled after only a few hours, claiming unseen hands shoved them from ladders. Fishermen report bones tangled in nets so often that it became routine. "Just throw it back," they'd mutter, as if discarding driftwood. The island soil, thick with human ash, is said to be so fertile that grapevines grow unnaturally fast. That might sound poetic until you realize what that really means. You're eating wine from grapes fattened on human remains. Venetians laugh nervously when tourists ask about it, but the laughter never lasts long. And then there are the voices. Ghost hunters. Yes, the kind with night vision cameras and bad haircuts, have sworn they captured disembodied whispers. But skeptics don't get off easy either. A few archaeologists who try to catalog the plague pits left with fractured psyches, rambling about faces in the dirt. One never published again. The deepening mystery isn't whether the island is haunted. The deeper question is why it feels like it wants to be. Places don't usually cling this hard to their past. Most ruins crumble. Most battlefields fade into meadows. But Poveglia refuses to be forgotten, as if it's addicted to the weight of fear. And that's the detail that gnaws at me. It's not just haunted, it's hungry. You'd think a place like this would have been dissected by historians, cataloged by scientists, picked clean by skeptics until there was nothing left but stone foundations and bad folklore. But Poveglia resists. The investigations that do exist are fragmented, contradictory, and often tainted by a kind of nervous laughter, as though the researchers themselves weren't entirely sure they wanted answers. Italian officials have long treated the island like an embarrassing family secret. Records confirm its use as a quarantine station. Yes. Military outpost. Yes. Psychiatric hospital. Yes. But beyond those stark entries, the paper trail fades. It's almost surgical, the way the archives cut off, as though someone deliberately starred the future of too much detail. Paranormal investigators have filled that vacuum, and their findings are grotesque. EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, supposedly captured desperate pleas in dialects centuries dead. Heat sensors track figures moving through empty corridors. Human-shaped voids colder than the air around them. One crew swore they heard the bell tower toll, even though its bell had been removed decades before. But let's strip away the theatrics and look logically. There are theories that explain some of the madness without summoning ghosts. The soil is indeed heavy with decomposed remains, carbon-rich, oxygen-poor. Breathing in certain gases can cause hallucinations, paranoia, even full-blown psychosis. Combine that with an asylum's reputation for abuse, and you have a recipe for legends. Others argue the doctor's infamous death, leaping from the bell tower, was nothing supernatural. Perhaps he was cornered by angry patients. Perhaps he simply snapped under guilt. Maybe it was just a fall, and the mist-shrouded hands that finished him are the embroidery of terrified witnesses. And yet every theory frays at the edges. The gases might explain whispers, but not shadows moving against the light. Mental illness might explain stories of screams, but not the eerie consistency of accounts across centuries. How does folklore about plague pits seamlessly dovetail with reports from modern-day thrill seekers? Why does every investigation, whether official or amateur, end the same way, with people fleeing the island, pale, shaken, and unwilling to return. It leaves us with a choice. Either hundreds of years of people, from peasants to professors, all fabricated the same nightmare, or the island itself holds something that refuses to be reasoned away. There's always a moment when a story about ghosts stops being just about ghosts and starts being about people cracking open. For Poveglia, that moment came in the mid-20th century, when Italy tried to quietly erase the asylum's existence. The hospital was closed, the patients relocated, and the island locked down. Official explanation? It was no longer suitable for care. But whispers tell a sharper story. Too many breakdowns, too many staff resignations, too many reports of incidents that couldn't be stamped with bureaucratic ink. Caretakers claimed they saw patients vanishing from locked rooms, only to be found cowering in corners, clawing their own faces bloody. Nurses swore they heard footsteps pacing the halls at night, but when they followed the sound, every ward lay empty. One doctor resigned mid-shift, leaving behind a journal scribbled with entries like, "The island is not ill. The island is illness." The breakdown wasn't confined to the hospital. Local authorities refused to assign police patrols there. Fishermen flatly refused to sail near it, even when threatened with fines. By the 1960s, Venice wanted nothing more than to wash its hands of the island. The breakdown was systemic, an entire culture saying, in effect, we will pretend it does not exist. And yet, silence didn't erase it. The ruins still loomed in the lagoon, a scar you couldn't quite ignore. Thrill seekers, historians, and daredevils began sneaking in, and what they reported wasn't just the usual haunted house cliches. One group described hearing the bell tower toll, 6 deep, resonant clangs, though the bell itself had been dismantled years prior. Another claimed they were driven to hysteria by a sound like hundreds of voices whispering in unison. The breakdown, the turning point, is this. Even after abandonment, Poveglia did not fade into irrelevance. It grew louder. An island without people should be silent. Instead, it became deafening. And the louder it grew, the harder it became to tell if the madness belonged to the island, or to us, insisting that it couldn't possibly be real. Here's the cruel joke. There is no resolution. Not a neat one. Anyway, Poveglia never had its trial, its exorcism, its cleansing ritual. There's no ribbon at the end of the story that says justice served, case closed. The asylum closed, the staff scattered, and the government just looked away. The island was sealed, and for decades, nobody was allowed to step foot there. Officially, it was unsafe. Unstable structures, asbestos, the usual excuses. But Venetians didn't need official explanations. They already knew. Attempts were made, half-hearted, doomed attempts, to repurpose the island. At one point, an entrepreneur tried to buy it, to turn it into a luxury hotel. The deal fell through before renovations even began. Workers hired to survey the land supposedly refused to spend the night, citing strange occurrences that never made it onto paperwork. Another scheme pitched a private residence, a billionaire's Venetian hideaway. That too evaporated, because money is powerful, but fear is older, and the unanswered questions stack higher than the weeds around the bell tower. How many bodies actually rest beneath the soil? Records claim thousands. Archaeologists estimate hundreds of thousands. Which is right? Which is worse? What really happened to the asylum doctor? Did madness push him, or did something else pull him? Why do multiple modern-day visitors describe the same sensations? Burning skin, invisible hands, phantom bells, with uncanny consistency. Some say the lack of resolution is the resolution. That Poveglia was never meant to be solved, because you can't solve a wound that deep. It isn't a mystery, it's a scar, a permanent mark that screams at anyone who touches it. The plague pits, the executions, the asylum, all of it is less a series of events and more a pattern, repeating cruelty etched into stone. So the lingering question isn't what happened. We know what happened. The real question is why we keep circling it, like moths around a pyre, desperate to touch the flame even though we know it burns. You'd think an island like this would vanish into footnotes, swallowed by archives and bad memories. But Poveglia refuses to rot quietly. Its legacy seeps like smoke through Venice itself, whispered by gondoliers, muttered by tour guides, rolled into cautionary tales parents tell their children. The aftermath is physical. The soil, black and spongy, is said to be made of 60% human ash. Think about that. Entire vineyards, wild figs, thick grass all sprouting from what used to be bodies. Botanists marvel at the fertility, but Venetians wrinkle their noses. No one eats fruit from Poveglia. No one drinks wine from its grapes. Not because they think it tastes bad, because they know what it tastes of. The aftermath is cultural. Poveglia has become shorthand for damnation, invoked in ghost tours and horror novels. But locals don't joke. Ask a fisherman and he'll tell you, without smiling, that nets still dredge up bones. Ask an old Venetian, and they'll insist the asylum never truly closed, that if you stand outside its walls at night, you'll hear the cries of patients who should have died a century ago. And the aftermath is political. The Italian government has tried multiple times to auction the island. Developers salivate at the idea of a luxury resort, a gilded hotel rising from centuries of charnel dirt. But every attempt collapses. Investors walk away. Foundations crack before construction even begins. It's as if the island itself rejects reinvention, refusing to be whitewashed into something palatable. That's the legacy. Resistance. Poveglia doesn't allow forgetting. It doesn't want to be rehabilitated or prettified. It wants to remain what it is, a monument to suffering, a reminder carved into the lagoon that beneath every empire's marble facade are the bones of the expendable. And maybe that's why people still sneak there, still film shaky YouTube explorations, still whisper about it in bars. It isn't just a ghost they're chasing. It's the uncomfortable truth the island embodies. That civilizations are built on graves, and some graves never stop screaming. Some places are museums. Some are ruins. Poveglia is neither. It's a wound that refuses to close, festering in the middle of the lagoon dressed up for postcards. Venice sells romance, masks, gondolas under a bleeding sunset. But just a short boat ride away sits the truth, a grotesque reminder that beauty is always built on rot. I can't stop thinking about that doctor. Not a supposed ghost, not the folklore stitched around his fall, but the fact that we don't even remember his name. History remembered Galileo. It remembered Casanova. But the man who turned skulls into ash in the name of science, gone, erased, as if the island itself swallowed not just his body but his identity. That terrifies me more than the whispers, more than the bones. Oblivion as punishment, oblivion as justice. And maybe that's the real curse. Not the voices, not the phantom bells, not the shadows pacing the ruins. The curse is that Poveglia will never be allowed to rest. Because every time we try to look away, we come crawling back. Every generation builds new myths on its soil. Every tourist dares each other to sneak in. Every historian opens the files only to find gaps shaped like screams. So we circle it endlessly, drawn by morbid gravity. Not because we want answers, but because Poveglia is the answer. The answer to what happens when you compress centuries of death, cruelty, and neglect into one patch of earth, and then try to pretend it's just another island. And when the wind shifts, carrying the salt air over the lagoon, you can almost imagine the bell tower tolling again. Not for the doctor, not for the patients, not for the plague victims. For us. Because one day our cities, our empires, our illusions of permanence will collapse too. And somewhere under the rubble, another island will be born. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.